Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. Today's session is the first of a two-part series of webinars that are going to focus on separated bike lanes. Today we're going to talk about planning for separated bike lanes and more about how these bike lanes can support a community's bicycle network and some other considerations on the front end. Next Tuesday, during the second part of the series, we're going to talk more about specific design considerations. My name is Dan Jaleen. I'll be facilitating the webinar today, and we're joined by several panelists who will be providing presentations. Dan Goodman first is going to present. He works with the livability team within the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Human Environment, and he'll be sharing some information about the work that the Federal Highway Administration is doing to promote bicycle network improvements. Carl Sundstrom is a Senior Research Associate with the Highway Safety Research Center at the University of North Carolina, and Ben Rosenblatt is a Senior Planner with Sam Schwartz Transportation Consultants. Carl and Ben help lead the development of the Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide for FHWA, and they'll be providing the main presentation this afternoon. And we'll also be hearing from Kyle Rowe. Kyle works with the Seattle Department of Transportation, and he'll be talking about some of the separated bike lane work going on right now in Seattle. We're thrilled to have all the panelists here with us today, and we're very much looking forward to their presentations and the discussion. I'd like to shift gears just for a moment to go through a few housekeeping items. Attendees, if you can hear me, please click the hand icon that's located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. That'll let me know that the webinar is working properly and that everybody can hear me. So I'll give you a moment to put your hands up. Okay, great. Seeing a lot of hands going up out there. Fantastic. All right, glad you all could join us today. If for whatever reason your computer freezes during the session, please just reload the website and log back into the program, and you should be able to rejoin the session. We'll be posting the presentation slides and a recording of the webinar to the PBIC website, so you will be able to look back at anything you missed. The presentation slides will be available within a couple of days, and the video archive should be available within 1 to 2 weeks. And actually, I posted the slides as a PDF file in the handouts section of your control panel on GoToMeeting. So navigate to the right place. You should be able to download that file. If that doesn't work, don't worry. You will be getting access to it within a day or two. Please just note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar, although you will have the ability to submit questions and comments to us using the chat function. Feel free to ask questions at any time. We're going to hold about 20 to 30 minutes for a discussion session after the presentations have concluded. Later today, you're going to receive a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center with a link that will allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for the webinar. If you're attending the webinar with multiple attendees, please just make sure to forward that email to each of them so that everyone can generate a certificate of attendance. The email is also going to contain a link to the archive page where we'll be posting the presentation materials from today's webinar, which includes the PDF slides, as well as the archive video, which will be available there within 1 to 2 weeks. The webinar has been submitted to the American Planning Association for 1.5 CM credits. I'd encourage you to please check the online AICP event calendar for more information about how to claim those. You can learn more about PBIC webinars or check out past webinars at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. Before we get started, I would like to take a quick poll of the audience. We're interested in finding out how many people are out there watching the webinar today. So if you could just vote real quick just to let us know how many people are attending at your site, whether it's just you or a few people or maybe a larger group. We'll keep this open for maybe about 15 more seconds or so, and then we'll get right along with our presentations today. Okay, just a few more seconds to cast your vote. We'll go ahead and close that up and move along. Okay. Thank you all very much for that. It's some valuable information for us. I really appreciate it. I do want to cover a couple of things before we get started. I don't know how many of you have seen this new resource. It just came out yesterday. It's a really helpful resource on kind of visualizing bicycle networks. It sort of features a lot of different types of maps and other visualizations of bicycle networks from different cities, states, regional organizations, counties, to kind of give you some ideas about how you might go about thinking about your bicycle networks and how all of these pieces fit together. We'll kind of keep referring back to the point that separated bike lanes provide one key piece of any bicycle network that can be a number of different facilities all kind of working together. So I'd encourage you to download this resource if you haven't checked it out already. It is available online at the link there. I'll also try to drop the link into the chat pod so you can visit it directly at some point during the webinar. But that's just one thing I wanted to make you aware of. And now what I'll do is turn it over to Dan Goodman to kind of kick us off from the FHWA perspective. So Dan, go right ahead.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Dan Goodman. I'm in the Office of Human Environment, which is in the Office of Planning, Environment, and Realty at the Federal Highway Administration. Carl and Ben are on this webinar. Carl and Ben are going to be providing a review of the content of FHWA's Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide. I want to kick things off by really providing a national context for the information that will follow. Next slide, please. So what we're talking about today is really in support of our current policy, USDOT's current policy statement on bicycle and pedestrian accommodation. And that's really that it's our policy to incorporate safe and convenient walking and biking facilities, that we all have a responsibility to improve conditions and opportunities for walking and biking, and that we really need to be thinking about going beyond minimum standards to provide safe and convenient facilities. So that's really a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, and it's a lot of the benefit that separated bike lanes bring as part of, as Dan mentioned, as part of a connected network of bicycle infrastructure that really makes walking and biking viable transportation choices for everyone, and that's people of all ages and abilities. Next slide, please. So as you know, we've got a secretary that is very focused on pedestrian and bicycle safety. One of the many things that he's working on and has spearheaded is a mayor's challenge for safer people, safer streets. This is an activity that has engaged more than 240 different leaders of communities across the U.S. to really focus on pedestrian and bicycle safety and really think about real, tangible steps that we can make to improve safety for everyone. And so the information that FHWA is putting out and has been putting out over the course of the last year is really in support of the Mayor's Challenge and the broader Safer People, Safer Streets initiative. Next slide, please. So FHWA is also leaning forward on pedestrian and bicycle transportation. We're really leaning in on this topic because walking and biking are viable transportation modes. We are supporting an integrated, safe, and convenient transportation system. We're promoting sustainable transportation policies. We've made very clear that FHWA supports flexibility in the design of pedestrian and bicycle facilities. And really, we're leaning in on the concept of connected networks. The mapping idea book that Dan mentioned is one of many resources that we're using to really encourage and push our partners and stakeholders to really be thinking from a network perspective and really thinking about how do we connect people to destinations, how do we make walking and biking for short trips an option for everyone. So we're really focused on connected networks. We're also pushing our partners and stakeholders and we're pushing ourselves to really move the ball forward on the data element. So we've got a lot of activities at FHWA and DOT focused on pedestrian and bicycle data. We're also working with MPOs and state DOTs and national organizations to really stand up ongoing pedestrian and bicycle data programs because we see it as really a fundamental part of the equation where we need to go moving forward. As you've heard, our secretary and our leadership are also very focused on equity, ladders of opportunity, and we're really making the linkage between our transportation investments and our quality of life and livability. So these are all things that are really supported by the separated bike lane facility type and the document that you'll be hearing about today. Next slide, please. I also want to emphasize that FHWA has staff in every single state in the U.S. That are really engaging on these issues. So we've participated in and led pedestrian and bicycle safety assessments in every state over the last year. And we really see on-the-ground assessments as a way to focus on pedestrian and bicycle safety issues and identify improvements that are needed as part of ongoing projects. The assessment exercises is a really important way to build relationships with the key stakeholders, and it's also to share an experience and discuss it on the ground in the field, because as you know, the experience walking and biking is a very fine-grained thing, and so you need to be out experiencing it on foot or on wheels, really understand the dynamics of each individual unique situation. But we've got staff in every division office that are really engaging on these issues, and they'll continue to do that moving forward. Next slide. So another point on context that sort of I think is important to think about on the front end of this presentation is that the Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide is really one of a suite of pedestrian and bicycle resources that we're putting out and that we'll continue to put out at the national level. Taken kind of as a whole, these resources are really intended to help communities achieve connected networks, to improve safety, to promote equity, and really encourage trips, encourage walking and biking trips. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, separated bike lanes are one facility type that can be used as part of a broader strategy of creating connected bicycle networks in communities throughout the U.S. Next slide. So another thing I want to emphasize on the front end is that FHWA has specifically added separated bike lanes into our funding eligibility table. That's on our website, and we did that because we wanted to confirm that yes, you can use federal funds to build these facilities. So I think that is something that's an important point to keep in mind as you listen to the information that follows. Next slide, please. Another thing that we're doing is really proactively addressing misconceptions that people may have. One of them is that we heard in talking to partners and stakeholders is that some folks felt like you couldn't use federal funds to build this particular bicycle facility type. So we're, as part of our strategy of really leaning into these issues, we're proactively addressing misconceptions, and this is one of them. The misconception being that you can't use federal funds to do these facilities, and we very clearly said that's false. Federal funds can be used, so there should be no confusion about that moving forward. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that FHWA is really pushing hard on the pedestrian and bicycle data side, and I think on the question of separated bike lanes, the data piece is particularly important. So I want to really emphasize early on for the folks that are either planning separated bike lanes, or they're constructing them, or they've got some in the ground and they're planning more. I really want to emphasize the importance of collecting before and after data on any separated bike lanes that you're putting into your community. As we went through our process, we did a comprehensive safety assessment and crash assessment of separated bike lanes, and one of the things that we found in that process is that we need more and better data. And so I really want to encourage folks to be collecting data before you actually implement a separated bike lane, to be collecting a baseline of volume data and also crash data, so that we understand the full story of what impact those separated bike lanes had in a community. So if you are considering separated bike lanes but they're not in the ground, now is the time that you should be collecting volume data in particular and also crash data. Next slide, please. So to wrap things up, I just want to mention a few things that I think they relate to the content that we'll be talking about today. One of them is a document called Achieving Multimodal Networks, Applying Design Flexibility and Reducing Conflicts. This is a pedestrian and bicycle design resource that FHWA will be publishing in the next couple weeks. So stay tuned, and it includes pretty detailed planning and design information on separated bike lanes that builds off of the design information that you'll hear about today, and that was included in the separated bike lane planning and design guide. We'll be publishing a strategic agenda for pedestrian and bicycle transportation later this summer, and that's really going to lay out our priorities over the next 3 to 5 years, and you can expect to see more information on separated bike lanes in our strategic agenda, because there's a lot that we still need to know. We're also working on a multimodal networks in small towns and rural communities resource that is again going to be a design heavy resource really focusing on smaller rural communities, and so we'll be looking at separated bike lanes as part of that document and thinking about where they apply in all land use contexts. Our colleagues at the Federal Transit Administration are also working on a guidebook for enhancing pedestrian and bicycle connections to transit, and that document, we're working closely with them on that document, and it'll be referencing a lot of the design information that we have talked about so far in this presentation that you'll hear about in Ben and Carl's presentation. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll wrap it up. You'll see on the slide some names of FHWA staff in the different offices that specialize in pedestrian and bicycle transportation. You're welcome to reach out to the folks on the slides, and you're also welcome to reach out to me if you've got specific questions, if there's anything that you need addressed. So Dan, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. I really appreciate it. I think that takes us into right into the main presentation today. I would encourage you to download the slides or look back at them for all of these contacts, but I'm going to go ahead and shift gears right now and send things directly over to Ben and Carl so they can take over their presentation. So Ben and Carl, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take the screen and go ahead and pull your slides up, and we'll be ready to go. All right.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Dan. We're happy to be here. Carl and I did a lot of work putting this separated bike lane planning and design guide together over the last couple of years, and we're happy to have people join us today to kind of go through the planning process and talk about it a little bit. So we're going to just talk about the entire planning process and kind of outline it the way we did in the guide with some additional examples. Before we do that, we wanted to clearly define what we're talking about today. So what are separated bike lanes? The definition you see on your screen comes directly from the planning and design guide. So I'm going to read through it and then talk about the different elements, because there's a lot of specifics in here that are pretty critical in determining what separated bike lanes are and what they are not. So a separated bike lane, or SBL, is an exclusive facility for bicyclists that is located within or directly adjacent to the roadway, and that is physically separated from motor vehicle traffic with a vertical element. So the first piece in there is exclusive facility for bicyclists. So when we're talking about separated bike lanes, we are not talking about multi-use paths, which sometimes bicyclists will share with joggers, pedestrians, people on hoverboards, et cetera, et cetera. And we're also not talking about shared lanes in which bicyclists share space with motor vehicles. So it's exclusively for bicyclists. It needs to be within or directly adjacent to the roadway. So this is another way to distinguish SBLs from off-street paths or side paths. Typically, SBLs are either in the roadway, or if they are raised at sidewalk level or somewhere in between sidewalk and street level, they are still directly adjacent to the street, with typically with vehicular traffic. There's physical separation from motor vehicle traffic with a vertical element. So it includes both a horizontal separation, which you see here in the photo on the buffered lines between the bike lane and the travel lane, and also some sort of vertical element. So if it doesn't have a vertical element, we, for the purposes of this exercise, did not consider it a separated bike lane. So in this case, in the photo, you see the flex posts. And then one more note about SBLs. We received this question quite a bit as we were developing the guide. Separated bike lanes we are treating the same in terms of terminology as protected bike lanes, which are also the same things as cycle tracks. So FHWA decided that separated bike lane was the term that they wanted to use. So here, this is another illustration from the guide, just showing the differences between facility types. From the top going down to the bottom, you see the differences in separation between bicycle traffic and vehicular traffic. So at the top, signed routes or even shared lane markings, those are typically often known as Class 3 bike facilities, where bicyclists share space with motorists. Moving forward, you have on-street lanes or buffered lanes, which provide separation distinctly via horizontal means, but with nothing vertical, no actual physical element. Then you have SBLs, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And then finally, you have off-street trails or side paths. And the differences between SBLs and side paths can be a little bit hazy at times. I guess the best way for us to remember it that we used in our thinking was that if there were frequent interactions with vehicular traffic, we were going to consider something a separated bike lane. If it was pretty much off-street, had some intersections but not many with vehicular traffic, it might be categorized as a side path. But it's worth noting that that definition can be a little hazy. So why do we want to put in separated bike lanes in our communities? I think Dan got to a lot of this information on the network side. One basic reason that you can think about why separated bike lanes might make sense in a certain case is simply to attract more riders. We've seen, and in our research and in a lot of other people's research, for instance, information that has come out of Portland State, a lot of cyclists are portrayed as interested but concerned. So they might be interested in using biking as a means of transportation and not just recreation, but they're concerned about potential interactions with vehicular traffic. So separated bike lanes, by their nature, are just more comfortable facilities than just typical on-street bike lanes. They also provide these other benefits, health, economic, environmental, and Carl's going to talk a little bit about that later. And finally, just providing these types of low-stress options can just create a more diverse set of users. Although we understand that some cyclists will certainly prefer riding in mixed traffic just because of speed or other reasons, there are many, many riders out there who do feel that the need for vertical separation is important in making it okay to bike. We also see separated bike lanes really as a traffic calming element. They should be a tool in every planner's toolkit to create streets in which discourage vehicular speeding and streets that encourage livability. So using separated bike lanes to quote-unquote organize traffic in a little bit of a better way, putting bicyclists in dedicated space, making sure motor vehicles know that bicyclists are there, separated bike lanes can help with that type of thing. They can also reduce effective crossing distances for pedestrians in terms of the distance required to cross over motor vehicle traffic, and they can provide refuge islands as well. And we'll get into that a little more next week in the design section. So now we're going to go through the planning process, but I think, Dan, you wanted to do a poll again?
Yeah, sure. I just want to take a moment to get your input on a few questions that we have here. So I wanted to have you all respond to this poll. We just want to get a sense from you all about how many of you are currently have separated bike lanes in your communities, whether you may have plans that recommend SBLs, but you don't have any yet. Or maybe you're still deciding if you should use them, or you pretty much know you're not going to be using them in your network. We just wanted to see if you could choose the best option that is relevant for your community among these choices. We don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is really an opportunity for you to give us some feedback on sort of how widespread these are in your areas and where you're coming at this issue from. So once a few more people vote in this poll, I'm going to maybe read the responses back just so you all are aware of what everyone said. So take a few more seconds to cast your vote. Unfortunately, we had to divide them into these sort of rigid categories. It's probably more open-ended in a lot of places, but do your best to maybe pick one option that fits your community. So I can already get a sense, and I'll probably go ahead and close this soon, but it looks like about 37% of you out there have at least one separated bike lane in your community. It looks like 22% of you are still deciding if you should use separated bike lanes. 20% of you have plans that recommend SBLs, but you haven't incorporated them yet. Only 3% have said that they're not going to use separated bike lanes. So that's pretty good. So at least somebody's considering it. And then another 20% or so just don't know or chose others. So that's fine. I think that feedback is really good for us to see, and it might help us frame the rest of the discussion. So I'll go ahead and close that poll. We should be able to get back into the presentation from there. But thanks, everybody, for your feedback.
Great, thanks, Dan, and great to see all the interest out there. So I think part one on this 5-part list kind of gets to a lot of the concerns that people and communities might have about how separated bike lanes work and where they shouldn't go and where they should go. So I'm going to review how we select locations for separated bike lanes and all the attributes associated with that. And then Carl is going to discuss the other issues related to planning, none of which are unimportant, that's for sure. They all certainly have a role to play. Okay, so what defines a successful location? So Dan Goodman already kind of alluded to this. The idea behind networks is one that FHWA is stressing and that we as bicycle planners certainly stress. A separated bike lane that is designed really, really well but connects no destinations to no other destinations and doesn't connect a facility to another facility is not something that you want to embark on. So if it's your community's first lane, you need to think about how your bicycle network already exists, what you want to see come out of it, and how separated bike lanes can fit in. So that first sub-bullet, connectivity means everything, is really true. In our interviews with cities around the country that have put in separated bike lanes, that was kind of the #1 goal of how they knew a separated bike lane would work. If it connected destinations that had a need and that they felt that people who were on bicycles might not be comfortable with currently, that is something that's going to create a successful bike lane. Looking at first and last mile issues, for instance, if you have a community in which there are a lot of relatively calm residential streets, but in order to access the train station you have to take an arterial for 2/3 of a mile, maybe that's the place that a separated bike lane belongs on. Filling gaps in the networks, you might have an existing bicycle network that is just in need of some upgrades. Maybe there are existing Class 2 bike lanes that just don't really provide the type of comfort necessary based on traffic volumes and number of lanes out there. So filling gaps in the network. And then looking at bike share, we feel that even since we published the guide, a tremendous amount of bicycle share systems have sprung up here in the US, and we think there's certainly a lot of benefits there, and we'll get to that a little later. So here's some information that I wanted to present that my company, Sam Schwartz, worked on a couple of years ago in Pasadena. We mapped the bicycle network not by facility type, but by its stress level or comfort level. This was adopted from Peter Firth's research with the Mineta Transportation Institute. And what I wanted to highlight here is the different colors on the map relate to the current feel of a facility for bicyclists. So the items in red are the ones that were on the bike plan but didn't necessarily have comfortable facilities. So you'll see that those might be the best places for separated bike lanes. And there's a lot of red on the map, obviously. So there are certain instances where you might actually have a facility that's already pretty good, but certain sections, particularly as you see the sections that go over the freeway that's cutting across the middle of the map, they become orange or red. So maybe those are places that you can strategically put SBLs in. Oops. Looking a little further, this is Woodbridge, New Jersey. So on the left side, in red, you see these barriers and what we've called high-stress streets, meaning streets that either have high speed limits or a large number of travel lanes that we felt that traditional bicyclists might not necessarily be comfortable with. If you take those lines off the network and you look at the image on the right, you see this island effect. You see these little islands of relatively low-stress areas that are not connected. So trying to connect island to island is one way. It's one of many ways, but one way to potentially include separated bike lanes as part of your entire package of bicycle facilities. And then back to bike share. This is a photo from Austin, Texas. So a couple of things are at play with bike share. Obviously, as we see more bike share systems, we're seeing more bicyclists who may be a little less confident riding on street. Maybe they haven't ridden for a while. Maybe they're typically used to riding only for recreation. But as we see bike share work as a viable transportation option, especially for relatively short trips under a couple of miles, we feel that there's a need, actually, to put in separated bike lanes to create the type of comfortable facilities to support the operations of bike share. So there's definitely a win-win situation in which the operator of a bike share system should definitely be in support of the spreading of these facilities where they make sense. Secondly, and I think even more practically, just you can see by the photo, bike share facilities provide a really great opportunity to create a buffer between the bike lane and the travel lane. So it certainly is being used in a lot of places as the actual vertical element of protection, or separation, I should say, in a separated bike lane planning. What else defines a successful location? Well, one thing you can do is, if you already have outstanding plans, bicycle plans for your city or your community, you might want to look at them and see where separated bike lanes fit in. Some cities have actually started to highlight specifically where separated facilities make sense in terms of their overall network plan. On the right side here, this is Los Angeles, so the items, the streets in blue, are streets that the city has already determined will be part of the low-stress network and will be slated for some sort of separated bike lane type treatment. And then Seattle, Kyle's going to talk about later, has really done a lot of great work with its bike master plan and figuring out where these types of facilities make sense and where they might not make sense. So as you can see here in Los Angeles, they created a pretty comprehensive plan for redeveloping and in some cases reconstructing, but in some cases, as in here, just retrofitting some of their large streets, what they call Great Streets. So soon after that plan came out, they were able to put a separated bike lane up on Reseda Boulevard, and it's been welcomed with pretty good reviews. What else defines a successful location? Well, another way to look at it in a slightly different lens is looking at safety. So Dan mentioned earlier that our data isn't necessarily great, and in our research for the separated bike lane planning and design guide, we definitely came into that unfortunate reality that a lot of data isn't necessarily out there. From this angle, though, what I want to get at is there's a perception versus reality issue, and does it really matter? I mean, of course, obviously, safety matters, and the raw numbers are going to be what's most important. But we found, or I should say Portland State found through a survey that 96% of separated bike lane users reported feeling safer as a result of the separated facility. So just by that nature alone, separated bike lanes can be a major success if they create a perception of safety, and that can create that really wonderful cycle of having more people riding on bikes. And by having more people out in the roadway riding on bikes, you develop a community that's more aware of bicycle riding. You develop a culture of more compliance in terms of motorists dealing with bicyclists. So that's really something that we want to highlight, and we highlighted in the guide. Here's an example just photographically in New York. So without even looking at what the data is, and the data does show pretty good numbers here, on the left side is the before condition on First Avenue, and the right side is the after condition. Anyone, even a 5-year-old, who might be riding a bicycle would agree that the condition on the right is a safer, and it feels like a safer place to ride. So just by that notion alone, you can do a lot with separated bike lanes to really enhance the streetscape, to create traffic calming, and really create a culture of just safer travel. And the most simple definition of success could be simply attracting ridership. So looking at the demand, where are people already riding? If you kind of have an idea about that in your community, maybe that's one place to start in terms of thinking about where a separated facility might make more sense, whether it be through an upgrade or just through a totally new facility. Where do people want to ride to? What are some of the big land use attractors in your neighborhood, in your community that encourage bicycling, and maybe try to thinking about ways to connect those attractors with communities and residential areas. And then looking at unmet needs, the holes in the network that I kind of referred to before, and the streets that seem like they need lower stress options. There might be streets that have bicycle facilities already, but maybe they were constructed 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they need to be upgraded for this kind of new way of looking at streets that FHWA is promoting, that USDOT is promoting, and that planners kind of across the country are starting to embrace. So in Alameda, California, we had an example in one of our interviews. This is a relatively new separated bike lane along Shoreline Drive. If you can imagine the sidewalk just to the left, on the very left side of this picture, that used to be the place where we saw a lot of sidewalk riding, and we saw a lot of conflicts between pedestrians and cyclists. This street is just adjacent to a beach, which is off to the left side, facing San Francisco. So it's obviously a big attractor. And there was a lot of bicycle riding already. So they knew that by constructing this bike lane, all they did was basically remove a travel lane and push the parking lane out to be floating. They knew that they would have high ridership. So they set themselves up for success by kind of predicting where they knew ridership would be maximized. And then here's one in New York about the unmet needs issue. On the left side is the before condition, and the right side is the after. This is Sand Street approaching the Manhattan Bridge in downtown Brooklyn. The Manhattan Bridge is one of the most heavily used bicycle facilities in the country. And a while ago, they didn't have really any relatively safe way to access the entrance to the bridge, the bicycle entrance. So they created this center running lane. It's only about 2 or 3 blocks long, but it has proven immensely successful in getting people safely to the place that they already wanted to go. So with that, I think, oh no, one more slide actually. One more thing about successful locations I wanted to highlight is the idea behind flexibility. So Dan mentioned that FHA is promoting flexibility in design for pedestrian and bicycle facilities. And our the design guide that we created, the separated bike lane planning design guide, really hammers that home. Being flexible on how you design a separated bike lane, and potentially starting with relatively inexpensive materials, can be a great way to determine if you're going to be successful or not. Pilot projects and all sorts of things like that are really helpful in figuring out how your community will embrace separated bike lanes. And we know every community is unique and has unique needs. So by doing kind of through a pilot approach, you're able to more easily figure out what will be a successful location down the line. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl to talk about the other planning issues.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's certainly a great overview of planning and defining success and identifying the locations where this type of bike facility makes sense and how it fits in with all the other types of bike facilities as part of a complete bicycling network. And so moving on to the second step part of this presentation, I want to talk specifically about installation opportunities and somewhat as how that relates to funding and the cost of these facilities. Starting with sort of just the minor street retrofit. So these are your most opportunistic locations where you can install a separated bike lane quickly and at a somewhat low cost. So you've identified corridors through your planning process where a separated bike lane may make sense. And in some cases, these may be on streets where possibly the lanes are quite wide and you have additional space just by narrowing the lanes. Maybe there's already existing bike lanes on that facility, and so you can sort of carve that buffer out from narrowing lanes that are oftentimes 12 feet or even wider down. So in urban environments, we don't necessarily need those 12-foot lanes. So just reallocating that street space within the existing right-of-way can be a pretty inexpensive way to upgrade the bike facilities. So just a photo example here. This is just a photo of such a facility in Syracuse, and you can see, this doesn't look like it cost a whole lot of money. This was simply, some paint on the street with some parking stops, some little curb, and a couple posts there at the intersection. So it doesn't have to cost a whole lot. And now they did upgrade this a little bit with some bicycle signals and other types of treatments, and that's something that we'll get into in part 2 next week. But just the idea that it can be done with at a lower cost to begin, and then upgraded further once the design has been set and sort of the public has accepted it. The second step, or the next sort of step up in terms of designing separated bike lanes are more major retrofits. So these often would go along with the restriping or resurfacing, and Dan Goodman mentioned the resurfacing guide that FHWA has out, and that's a fantastic guide. I'd recommend anyone open it if you haven't. There's all sorts of tremendous information in there that relates specifically to this. But you can consider changing the number of travel lanes. Oftentimes, we see better results by reducing the number of travel lanes and sort of smoothing and organizing that flow of traffic. There's also potentially you could reduce on-street parking. I know that's probably the stickiest issue that you're going to face, but it's certainly a possibility. If you start with good data and developing that buy-in with the the business and residents early. And so if you pay attention to sort of the resurfacing schedule, you can really reduce costs by starting with that fresh, clean slate, and you can go in and your new stripes down to your new roadway configuration pretty easily. So here's just another photo of Dearborn. So you can see they actually, the buffer here is quite small, but they used a high number of flexible posts in the buffer, as well as the green conflict markings at those driveways, just to squeeze this separated facility in. And then finally, sort of is talking about capital. And I think the big takeaway here is, separated bike lanes, if they can be a really tremendous asset to a bicycle network. And if you have a big capital project, start thinking about adding separated bike lanes in early in the process. It doesn't necessarily have to take up that much more roadway width. And if you include it in the design from the start, you can really reduce that cost rather than going in and adding that facility later. So when you start adding the facility later, you start running into issues like drainage and all sorts of median islands and everything else. And so if you get that into the planning process right at the start, you can really design the best facility for all roadway users. A great example here is the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, and this is a section where we would consider it a separated bike lane, where you can see the sign describes that on the left is the sidewalk and on the right is that separated bike lane. Looks like the two-way facility here and then the travel lane. So this is, this is sort of the high end of what a separated bike lane can look like. The beautiful facility here with landscaping and decorative pavers. And this was a tremendous success. I think something like within a block of this corridor, the land value doubled after the installation of this. So there's a tremendous value to this as well, not just increasing ridership, but to increasing land value and other elements that we'll describe in just a little bit. And then pilot projects. So talked about how you can use inexpensive materials, and this can be a great way to get that public buy-in. Especially if this is the first one in your community, it may make sense to just call it a pilot project. Put it down with temporary materials. It could be planters and flexible posts and some paint, and it can really give people a sense for what this facility looks like. It allows for public comment, and then you can change your design a little bit, tweak it. So that's not a sign of failure. Is if you have to go back in, something wasn't working right. It doesn't mean that the project failed. In fact, it's that's a normal part of the process for these separated bike lanes, is to go back in and tweak that design a little bit and see, okay, we're still seeing conflicts with turning vehicles, or we're still seeing pedestrians don't understand where to go, or we're having parking issues. And so there's any number of things that can come up that are a little bit unexpected. And it is a newer facility type, so we're still finding the best way to design these facilities under different conditions. And so by having sort of a pilot project, you can really go out there and find the best solution for your particular community and location. Here's a great photo of one in Salt Lake City. You can see they just went in with some paint and post. And I like this photo too, because it really demonstrates sort of some of the safety benefits that you can see, not just for bicyclists but for all the roadway users. You can see where the old curb radius was for cars that were turning, and how it seems to be tightened up there. So on the right, cars could make that right turn much faster, and then in the left there you can see the radius is much tighter. You can also see the crossing distance has been reduced considerably for pedestrians, at least in terms of their exposure to motor vehicle traffic. So there's a lot of benefits here for this. And then you can see how easy it is to just sort of change that around as needed, and then come back in later and make it a more permanent build out. Another example, so Boulder has a really nice program set up, and not just for separated bike lanes, but for all their transportation improvements. That's just, they call it the Living Lab, and it's a way to install different facilities and experiment with different roadway types and conditions and designs, and receive feedback from the public about what they like, what they don't like, what changes they'd like to see or keep in place. And so this is just a beautiful example of a separated bike lane facility that they installed in Boulder here, with some posts and some curb stops as their vertical elements there in the buffer. And so the next item to talk about is maintenance consideration. And this is something certainly you want to plan ahead with your design. Focusing on the width in this case, and the maintenance equipment that you have or may need to purchase. Specifically talking about street sweeping, or sweeping the lanes, as well as in the colder states, plowing. And so there's a lot of considerations that go in there. For example, this we'll talk a bit about design, which we'll get into later, but one-way versus two-way separated bike lanes. Well, two-way separated bike lanes, of course, are going to be a little bit wider, and so because of that, you may be able to fit larger street sweeping equipment in and larger plows. Also, the buffer makes a big difference. If you have sort of a raised curb buffer, you may narrow it, versus if you have a painted buffer, or where you place that buffer can make a difference in terms of how you can get those maintenance vehicles in there. And then the other part is really to think about who performs the maintenance. So certainly having the city come in as part of their routine maintenance and routine sweeping is a great way to keep these facilities clear. But also having local partnerships and developing maintenance agreements and working with the local business improvement districts, sort of keep the facilities clear, well swept. If there are planters or other decorative elements, to keep the landscaping in good shape and tidy. So, developing those agreements with the local businesses can be really successful. This is just a photo here of Boulder with clearly a snow plow plowing the lane, and I love that it appears to be at least plowed before the road in this example. But imagine that if this was 2 feet narrower, you would have a real problem. Maybe they have equipment that fits there, but maybe not. And then and what do you do at that point? So do you have to go back and redesign your lane, or do you have to go back and purchase new equipment? So just think about that from the start. Have an inventory of your equipment. It's really a key to saving money in the long term. And then public outreach is critical, especially with bike lanes. You want excuse me, you want to have people ride, and you want people to be comfortable, but you want them to also be excited about this and understand what the benefit is. But it is a newer facility type, and there's some education that goes along with that. So continuous outreach, before, during, after. So starting early and often is really key. Focusing with the general public during the planning and design stages, and especially the residents along that corridor. Outreach with the business community along the proposed corridor, and what impacts they may have on their deliveries, on their parking, what concerns do they have, and then also selling the benefits. We have a lot of great examples of the economic benefits of separated bike lanes and how that can actually improve your business. And so, working with the business leaders to understand that, and then also, of course, coordinating with public agencies on traffic safety, and selling the benefits of organizing the roadway in that fashion. Working with transit agencies, almost all of these are often going to be on transit routes, or working with them, and how does that affect operations with their transit vehicles. Emergency vehicle access, can emergency vehicles access buildings, as needed, especially fire trucks. And other issues, maintenance. There's a whole host of agencies that you'd want to reach out to and work with. And of course, advocates on this slide are really key, a key supporter, and someone you should work with to make sure that your project is successful and people are excited about it. So, I covered a lot of this already. I think got ahead of myself, but public engagement and outreach win, early and often, working early in the design process, that can save money in the long term. And then, also after, just understanding, what went well, what didn't go well, and how can we improve in the future projects, both design as well as the outreach. So this is an example of what was done in Jackson, Wyoming, where they actually worked with a local advocacy organization to get that support. They put advertisements in the local newspaper. They put up temporary signage during the initial rollout period, all to let people know what this type of facility is, and this is especially important for municipalities where it's their first separated bike lane that they're installing. And then public engagement, working especially with business owners and business improvement districts can be one of your biggest supporters. And we have a few examples in the FHWA separated bike lane guide about different business improvement districts that have been really enthusiastic about it. One example is the Downtown Development Authority in Miami, and they were excited because because of their ability to attract those interested but concerned riders and sort of draw them to the commercial district and ride slower and spend more time. And then, another example is for Seattle and Amazon. Actually, Amazon is putting in on 7th Avenue there by their headquarters, separated bike lane, and they're paying for that for a better street there, their own headquarters. So there's a lot of great examples about working with businesses. Here's that Reseda Boulevard that Ben mentioned earlier, and just having informational signage about where to park, where to drive. The parking lane got shifted out to the left now, so making sure drivers understand where to go, and pedestrians to understand where to walk. So all this is really important, especially for earlier examples. Here's an example from a similar example from Seattle, and they have great examples too about loading zones and how trucks should load and unload and not block the bike lane, and be aware of the bicyclists that are in that facility. And then finally, evaluation. Dan Goodman had some great slides about crash and volume data collection, And so I just want to point out that there's a lot of good information out there, and the appendix of this report, this guidebook, also has some really good guidelines there. But the bottom line is, we have pretty good information on crashes at facilities. Our biggest issue there is that it's a newer facility type, and luckily there aren't that many crashes that are occurring. So we're still collecting that data to really get some better answers, specifically, at intersections and how we're designing intersections. We don't necessarily have that level of crash data yet. So there are other ways to study that, using proxy measures and other types of information, but we're getting more crash data, and that's what's important. The bottom is also, we need help there. If you're thinking about installing, start collecting data on bike volumes before and after, and even on parallel corridors, and just develop sort of a consistent data collection protocol. And this is just a good rule of thumb for your bike facilities generally, not even just for this type of project. And then finally, holistic evaluation. Just to consider all street users, so not just bicyclists, but also pedestrians, transit users, deliveries for shops, and of course motorists. And so, to measure the important changes like crashes, fatalities and injuries, and also, volumes, but then also think about the other benefits such as retail sales growth, land values, attracting people to your downtown and other districts where you have these facilities, and then public health, so encouraging people to actually get out and ride bikes on these nicer, more comfortable facilities. And finally, just a case study here from, so New York City DOT is a great agency as an example of an agency that collects sort of that holistic evaluation. And they have a ton of data that's really good to look at. I'd recommend reading their Economic Benefits of Sustainable Streets report. But basically, what they're finding with these separate bike lanes is that they're seeing significant increases in bike volumes. They're seeing improved travel times due to the organized traffic for motor vehicles. Because of that, they're seeing higher ridership for their transit vehicles because of the buses are running more reliably. You can see the pedestrian islands there shorten that crossing distance, so they've seen a decrease in crashes for pedestrians. They have aesthetic benefits with the landscaping, and they've also seen increases in local revenue on corridors with separated bike lanes when compared to corridors without. So there's a lot of great information out there, not just for New York, but there's a lot of other cities that have really good information. So you can't. I know a lot of cities won't say, well, New York City is not like ours, but there's a lot of other good examples out there. So this is just one good example. So with that, I think we've passed our allotted time, and we want to make sure that we leave time for questions, and of course, Seattle's great presentation. So I'll turn it over to Dan and Kyle.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl and Ben, for that great overview. I'm going to go ahead and send things right over to Kyle. So Kyle, when you see that alert come across, you can go ahead and take over the screen. Getting to Carl's point that he just made about evaluation, since we have cities on the line and states on the line who have these projects, I'd encourage you with your questions that you're submitting to us, maybe if you can submit a little factoid or a little data point that you've gathered on the effects of your separated bike lanes, we'd like to maybe read some of those out during the Q&A. So send those to us if you have them, maybe changes in volumes or benefits in terms of crashes, other things like that. We'd be really interested to see that. So Kyle, I can see your screen, so whenever you want to go ahead and get started, go right ahead.
Great, thanks. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, fantastic. So yeah, that's a great start to the presentation. A lot of the stuff that I was talking about already will be in my presentation as well, more specific to Seattle. So yeah, I'm happy to answer questions that come up as well, and we do a lot of evaluation as was previously discussed. So all good stuff, especially the economic piece. That's a really growing field right now. So my name is Kyle Rowe. I'm an associate transportation planner with the Seattle Department of Transportation. And I'll be sharing with you some of the planning processes that we've gone through for building out our bike network. So we always start off our presentations with just the mission, vision, and core values of SDOT. These apply to all of our work, but specifically the Bike Master Plan touches on all 5 of these 4 core values of safe, interconnected, affordable, vibrant, and innovative for all people in Seattle. So what I'll be talking about today, first I'm going to start off with some background since not everyone here is from Seattle, obviously, share with you what's going on here talk about our 2014 update to the Bike Master Plan, and then how we go about implementing that plan. And then we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the Center City section of Seattle and how we use protected bike lanes to build our network, and then look at project examples. So some of you may have heard, and it's definitely the hot topic in Seattle for the last couple of years, is that we are a extremely fast-growing city. This picture is not a rare one to find any day in Seattle or any part of the city with all the cranes up. And I included a little clip from Seattle Times. For many years, we've been in the top couple cities of growing in terms of people living here and jobs. So keeping up with that growth is important for our department. But while we see all these people coming in, we also have consistently the worst traffic in the country. We're a very geographically constrained city with water bodies and a freeway that kind of divides our city in half. So really accommodating to other modes like walking, biking, and transit is important if we want to welcome all these new people and jobs into our city, which really set up the impetus for doing the Bicycle Master Plan and updating it in 2014. So in 2014, like I said, we decided that we needed to update our Bike Master Plan, and we needed to make it much more robust because a lot was changing in the field of planning and building for bikes. Namely the idea of protected bike lanes. So we use protected bike lanes out here. Sounds like separated bike lanes is what FHWA is going with, talking about the same thing. So protected bike lanes and neighborhood greenways were two facility types that really weren't in the toolbox previously, and that were becoming much more popular and becoming integral parts of our network. So we needed to think about those and how they fit in, and then also just update our vision and our policy framework. So the key element of the Bike Master Plan update that really set the stage for the whole document, everything from the network to the policies to the end-of-trip facilities, was that we needed to have a vision, and the vision was that riding a bicycle is comfortable and integral part of daily life in Seattle for people of all ages and abilities. And there's some key words in here. Comfortable and integral were very specifically chosen, and then all ages and abilities allows us to always point back to that when we're looking at our designs and thinking about the users. And when we get down to specific intersections and talk about who's going to use this, and we ask ourselves, would you ride this with your family, with your kids, with your mother, with your sister, and feel comfortable on it, not just the current users who are a little more confident in the street network. So taking this vision, we needed to update our long-term network that we were hoping to build in this 20-year plan. So we brought in all kinds of data to build this network out and basically create a citywide all ages and abilities network with a goal of having a facility within about a quarter to half mile of every single home in the city. And I'm going to touch more specifically on 2 points here of this analysis, and that's the destination density and the public input that we did for this planning process. So we used many data sets in GIS to create what we call the destination clusters. So if you see the key land use categories here on the slide, we took all these points in the city and used a GIS spatial analysis tool that basically created a density threshold at which we would say that this is a destination for biking in the city. It goes a little bit more beyond just like the urban village designation that we have from our Growth Management Act. So it's really helping us decide where do we need to make these connections throughout the city. And then we also verified that with public input. So we did the typical public outreach approach to a planning project. Many open houses. We went to dozens of community briefings with organizations and advocacy groups, met with stakeholders and elected officials and all that. But we also did this online tool where we put our street network on our website and asked people to answer a couple questions with lines on a map. So one of the examples was which streets in Seattle are the best to ride, and people were free to draw on the map however they so pleased. And then the same thing, we also asked them which are the worst to ride. And these are just two examples. We had a bunch of other questions with, like for example, one was which street would you ride if it was more comfortable, and that people were able to draw similarly. So this helped us kind of verify that we were, our data was telling us the same thing that our constituents wanted to see. So using all that input, we created a network for the entire city that built out, would be our 20-year vision build out of the bike master plan. And we had so many lines of the map, and we had so many different facility types that we decided that we really needed to break the network into two different categories. So what we did was we decided to do kind of what we call the spine or the backbone of the network, and we called it the citywide network. So these are the facilities that will connect people between neighborhoods, people making longer trips, more likely to be commuting to work or to school, or going to visit a friend in a different part of town. And then we have the local connectors network. So in this map on the screen, the dark blue lines, the solid lines, are the citywide network, and then the dashed lines in between are the local connectors network. A key designation we made for the citywide network is that they would only be facilities we considered all ages and abilities. So that is multi-use trails, protected bike lanes, or neighborhood greenways. To be a citywide network facility, you had to do one of those three. We wouldn't allow for a Shero or just a standard bike lane to be considered part of that network. And then we moved into, once we had the plan passed, we had to talk about how to implement it. So as part of the plan, we decided every year we were going to set our 5-year work plan in this public-facing document and explain exactly what it is we want to do, partially for transparency so that folks could know exactly what's coming on the horizon, but also it allowed us to partner with all these, with all this development coming in, all these opportunities, like was mentioned previously with Amazon, to have public-private partnerships for improving the street frontage at that development and maybe building a protected bike lane. We need to know, well, where are we going to look for protected bike lanes? So this document has that 5-year work plan in it. And a key element with this year's work plan is that we now have funding for this whole 5-year plan with the Levy to Move Seattle, which is the logo in the bottom right. So last year, voters passed by a good margin a $930 million levy to fund tons of improvements, which include the Bike Master Plan. And that has really allowed us to set this 5-year plan into a known budget that we can build out and reach our vision for that 20-year plan. So then to kind of figure out how we're going to, where do we start first? Which projects do you begin with? We built a prioritization framework that builds right off of the 5 goals of the plan, which are safety, ridership, equity, livability, and connectivity. And basically each segment, each project in this entire network of bike facilities is given a score for all 5 categories. So a lot of GIS analysis work that allows us to basically give a ranking for every single project, and then we can say that we're coming forward with a top ranking project. It's data driven, and we already have all the different elements that are telling us why it's ranking high. It really allows us to come to the community with a lot of background data to set the framework for why we're here. So that's kind of the background of how we go about implementing the Bike Master Plan. And then I wanted to jump a little bit more specifically into how protected bike lanes play a key role in this network. So looking at our existing all ages and abilities network today, so like I said before, neighborhood greenways, protected bike lanes, and multi-use trails, they're shown down here in the legend. This is what we have as of today, and as you can see, it's a very fragmented network. There's bits and pieces here and there. What's not shown here is our standard bike lanes, so they fill a lot of these gaps, but we're basically considering the fact that people riding with their kids in a baby hauler probably won't feel comfortable using those facilities, or we're not at least attracting new riders by providing those facilities. So we identified that we have a lot of gaps to fill with this network, and multi-use trails don't have as many opportunities because most of our multi-use trails are in old rail corridors, and we've built up most of them. There's a couple opportunities, but not many. Neighborhood greenways provide a lot of opportunity in the more residential neighborhood parts of the city, but not in the dense, more urban parts of Seattle. So looking at the center city, and you can see this is the map from the 2014 Bike Master Plan update, and then I have an inset here for downtown. You can see that only blue lines are really showing that citywide network for downtown. The protected bike lanes are really the only opportunity to provide that, aside from one trail that we just actually finished already next to the freeway. Aside from that, we're looking at protected bike lanes solely. So it's key to really figure out how to build these right, and we've done a couple so far, and they've had great success, and I'll jump into that later. But protected bike lanes are going to be the heavy hauler of bike facilities through downtown. And we know that this was a 2014 citywide planning process that made this map. We knew there needed to be more analysis on exactly how we would approach downtown Seattle. So we have the Center City Bike Network project that kind of actually took a step back and said, okay, well, we know we need to make all these connections. Let's go back to the drawing board for Center City specifically and create a network design, and then start knocking off these projects with paint on the street. And we've been able to go to the community with pretty robust data showing them that there is demand, and that when we build it, they do come. So the existing All Abilities Network on the left shows what we have, but on the right is data that we bought from Strava, which is an app that riders can use if they're going to keep a track of their trip. Some recreational cyclists also use it to kind of like compete on certain segments, but it's used by more than them. So you can see, the opportunity to make people more safe and comfortable on their bike commute is vast in downtown. And when we build facilities like we did on 2nd Avenue, we often capture a lot of people from adjacent streets and bring them on to that one area, kind of creating safety in numbers. So I wanted to jump into 2nd Avenue and the Westlake project more specifically to talk about some examples. So there should be a banner across here saying 2nd Avenue, but that's okay. This is 2nd Avenue in downtown Seattle after the project was complete. Oh, there it is. There's the title. So we had an existing 5-foot bike lane next to a parking lane, and I believe it was an 11-foot travel lane, and there was not much design at the intersections for bikes, really just continued through bike lane with a skip dash, and then turning vehicles shared the same phase to turn across the bike lane, and that resulted in a huge one of our highest collision locations for bicycling in the city. And we're starting to develop this implementation plan right after the BMP was passed, and at the same time we're about to launch Pronto Cycle Share, which is our bike share that launched 2 years ago. And the mayor of Seattle, Mayor Murray, announced that we're going to build the 2nd Avenue and protected bike lane before Pronto is launched. So he basically set the charge for us to do it, and we went forward in a very pilot fashion, like was discussed earlier in this webinar, and went from conceptual design to paint on the street in 4 months. But like was discussed previously, we had to go back and make tweaks. Things as simple as where the signal heads were located on the protected bike lane for the bikes and the vehicles was actually, very profound for the compliance of the intersections. So doing the pilot approach and just being okay with making those tweaks and working with the stakeholders throughout is very important. Our outreach for this project was really focused on the adjacent stakeholders. So we worked with people who had load zones, who needed that high turnover on-street parking, and worked with them to make sure that all their needs were being met. But we didn't necessarily open it to a large community discussion just because the mayor had kind of set the charge for that pilot project to go forward. So here you see a picture of before and after. It was just one-way southbound. Now we have two-way facility with protected phases for bikes going through every single intersection. It actually has improved the level of service for the left turn movements across for vehicles as well, because we have peds and bikes sharing a phase, and then the vehicles turning clear of all ped and bike movements. So while originally it would have seemed like we were taking away from the level of service for vehicles, they actually clear the left turns way quicker. So that was a great multimodal aspect of the project. And we've been looking at the data. We have a permanent counter out there on 2nd Avenue. We've had almost a 300% increase in bicycle ridership. It would have been obvious to assume a doubling of riders because we went from one-way to a two-way facility, but we saw even more than that. We've been trying to do a screen line analysis to see if we are capturing new riders or if we're really just grabbing people from 1st Avenue and 3rd Avenue and bringing them all onto 2nd. It's been really hard to do that based on the mixed facility types and the challenges that come with collecting that ridership data. But what we do know is that on 2nd Avenue there's been almost 300% increase in ridership, and it continues to grow. So that's great. It really helps us set the stage for the rest of the Center City Bike Network projects. And then one more project I want to touch on was the Westlake Protected Bike Lane. This is a project that took a very different approach in terms of the outreach that was done, but also, and it's also being built in a more high class, built with concrete and much different style than 2nd. I wanted to share that for comparison. So Westlake Avenue is a corridor that connects the Fremont Bridge, as you can see up here at the top of the screen, is sort of a funnel point for most of North Seattle that is north of the water to get to downtown. Unless you're pretty far northeast, you would use a different bridge, but the rest of North Seattle uses the Fremont Bridge. And then Westlake is this flat, very beautiful corridor along Lake Union that is currently the home to a two lanes in each direction roadway adjacent to a parking lot that is also public right-of-way. The parking lot currently serves all these marina and maritime industries that, there's a lot of yacht dealerships, and there's cruises that leave out of there, and all kinds of different marine uses that use that parking lot. So this has been identified in both the 2007 and the 2014 Bike Master Plan, and the advocates and the community and existing bicyclists were really asking us to move forward with this project. So we started it and immediately knew that it was going to be controversial. So we took a very different outreach approach than 2nd Avenue. We had a design advisory committee that was comprised of members of all different stakeholders, someone from our freight advisory board, many different folks that worked or owned businesses on Westlake, members of the bicycle advisory board, members of the Cascade Bicycle Club, pedestrian advocates, the whole gamut. And they had, I think, somewhere between 10 and 14 meetings. We had multiple open houses that were packed beyond capacity. It's just, extensive multi-year outreach process to get this project in. And the vision for the facility was to do some parking management and kind of redesign the way the parking lot worked and provide this two-way facility that would be between all of the business entrances and the parking lot. So it's still a protected bike lane because it's not shared with pedestrians, but it isn't necessarily right adjacent to the vehicle travel lanes. It's set off from them. So a little different design than your typical protected bike lane. And it's almost done. We're about halfway done with construction, and this is a picture that I took, I think, yesterday morning actually, biking in to work on it, and it's looking great. It's definitely a more full build out than most of our other protected bike lanes, which we do with paint and posts. And that's all I have for today. Happy to answer questions. Feel free to also send me an email or give me a call, and we can chat about planning for bikes in Seattle.
Great. Thanks so much, Kyle. I'm going to go segue right in here into our Q&A session, because I know that there are probably a lot of questions out there. I've received a lot of them, and I know already, I can tell you, we're not going to get through a lot of them, unfortunately. So we do have our contact information here, just in case you want to send us some follow-up notes and questions. I'll also say that a good portion of the questions we got have to do more with specific design issues and signal questions. We plan to get really into the nitty-gritty of a lot of that in part 2. So I want to take some time today to answer a lot of the questions pertaining to the subject matter here, the planning issues, a lot of that. But I hope you will be able to attend next week's session. If not, we will record that one too, so you'll hear all the information. I want to get right into some of the issues that were raised toward the beginning. You, Ben, and Carl kind of laid out the definition of what is a separated bike lane. But we continue to get a few questions, so I'll ask Ben and Carl maybe if they can explain to us the difference between a separated bike lane, a protected bike lane, and a cycle track from the perspective, I guess, of the information you shared today and the guidance issued by FHWA.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry, Ben and I are looking at each other. So it's right. Well, it's a good question, because I think there is a lot of confusion around this until we sort of at some point hopefully land on one term. But all three of those terms, separated bike lane, cycle track, and protected bike lane, are all the same thing. They're all referencing the same facility type. And so it's a little bit, the one that is not the same would be a a buffered bike lane. So a buffered bike lane would be a bike lane where it's buffered without a vertical element, and also you could have parking on the far side, so that cars could cross the bike lane, the buffered bike lane, to go to parking if there is parking on that facility. Now, if you swap that and had parking on the outside, that could be considered a vertical element if you have continuous parking. So that would be considered a separate bike lane, cycle track, or protected bike lane. Does that make sense to you, Ben? Are you?
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Ben. You want to elaborate on that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's about it with that. And then on the other side, which I had mentioned in my portion of the presentation, the difference between either separated protected bike lane or cycle track versus a side path, that difference kind of relates to how separated bike lanes are a little bit closer to vehicular traffic and have to deal with vehicular traffic more often in terms of interaction at intersections, driveways, etc.
Yeah, I think maybe to think about it, like generally there'd be a sidewalk on the outside of a separated bike lane facility. And one thing that may have gotten lost in the definition too is that they can be at street grade, at the same level as motor vehicle traffic, or they could be raised sort of at the sidewalk level. So it could be actually raised up, or it could be at some intermediate level. So it could be 6 inches above motor vehicle traffic. It could be at the same level as motor vehicle traffic, or it could be in between. All of that would still be considered a separated bike lane.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here briefly and say that our document says the separated bike lanes are also known as protected bike lanes and cycle tracks. The funding eligibility table includes the term cycle tracks and protected bike lanes. So just to reiterate what you said, Carl, it's all one and the same thing.
And I'll follow on that question with, and I guess I'll pitch this to everybody on the line. From your perspective, have you noticed different agencies trending toward a certain one of those terms? Is it? And I got a few questions mainly about some state DOTs that use sort of classification terminology that they may not want to use one term or another. Have you seen state DOTs or maybe local DOTs moving toward one of these terms as a preference, or is it sort of all over the board?
Well, I know that Massachusetts DOT published a design resource, and it's the separated bike lane planning and design guide.
Yeah, and that's actually
that's the only one I'm aware of.
Yeah, and I'd recommend looking at that. I get the sense that states are sort of following FHWA's lead with calling a separated bike lane, but maybe cities and advocacy groups are calling them protected bike lanes, and there's still a few people using cycle tracks out there, but I think that's probably the least common term at this point. That's sort of my impression.
Okay, and Kyle, are you all? I didn't get a clear sense from your presentation. Is there a certain term in-house that you typically use?
Yeah, here we definitely use protected bike lane pretty much across the board. If you, internally were to say separated bike lane or cycle track, people would know that you're talking about the same thing. But we've found that when we're talking to the public, especially people that aren't necessarily following bike planning, very, stakeholders that are only related because maybe they have an adjacent business, using the word cycle track doesn't work very well. It kind of gives the connotation of more of a high-speed facility that would maybe, bring some concerns about conflicts with pedestrians. So trying to communicate in the best way that this is a facility we're encouraging people to use and travel at a safe and slow speed is the best. And I think protected bike lane or separated bike lane both work for that.
Okay. In terms of the requirement, you mentioned there must be that vertical element there. A lot of questions about what constitutes that vertical element in terms of how continuous it needs to be. So if you're talking about bollards or planters, is there a certain frequency at which they need to be placed in order to be considered that continuous element, vertical element? And then some questions about whether other things can be used as that element. Somebody even asked about using a rumble strip to separate traffic. I wouldn't consider that really a vertical element, but there are lots of questions out there about what can or can't be used. A lot of questions, too, about parking. If parking is there, it probably could be considered that vertical element, but if the parking is underutilized, there was some concern that maybe that's not the element. So could you talk a little bit about maybe the parameters and the requirements, sort of rules of thumb for determining whether your vertical element fits all the requirements?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we'll try to spend a little bit of time on the vertical elements in the design presentation next week. Although that of course will be packed, so our time will be limited. I will reference the FHWA guide has quite a bit of information on different buffer types, but generally speaking, I think you want the most permanent or significant buffer type to be at the start and the end of a block, for example. And then in terms of the spacing, I think that that can be quite variable, and it depends on what you're using. And it also depends on if there's on-street parking or not. And it's a good point. So parking isn't necessarily a vertical element in itself because of the fact that at times you could have no cars parked there, and thus the vertical element would have driven off. But along those same lines, if you have on-street parking, you want to be aware of how that impacts your vertical element. So you don't want something to affect door opening, for example, and of somebody who's parked there. So I would reference sort of the guide in terms of spacing, but there's in terms of what you can use. There's rumble strips. I haven't heard necessarily that one before. I think you would want something more of a deterrent to keep vehicles from entering. Something more vertical, like at the very least a parking stop or some other something raised up higher than a rumble strip, which is obviously easily traversable.
Yeah. Okay. And Kyle, do you all have sort of go-to elements for your vertical elements that you use in your projects? So you showed a range of examples. So I'm wondering if it's all kind of context specific, or if you kind of try to steer toward one thing or another when you do these projects.
Yeah, we've definitely used simple paint and post the most for all of our protected bike lanes. So that would be just striping the buffer and then putting flex posts or delineator posts, whatever you call them, in that space. There's a few projects that have we've actually experimented with many different materials. So we do have a project that has jersey barriers that's physically protecting. It would be really almost impossible for a vehicle to get into the protected bike lane there. We on our Second Avenue project, that was a pilot, we just recently installed planters with wheel stops behind the planters. So that's kind of more of a element to beautify the street and make the facility more permanent, since we were able to show with data that the pilot worked well. And then aside from that, the only other thing I think we've used is a parking lane, but even when we have a parking lane, we're still putting something in the buffer so that the cars parking don't, on our first couple of projects, we had some issues with cars thinking that they could park in this, I don't know if they thought it was like a buffered parking lane or something, but they would consistently kind of come in and park in the bike lane. So we had to put up some posts in the buffer so that they knew that their parking spot was floating off of the curb.
A lot of questions. We usually get a lot of questions in our design focus webinars about from cities in northern climates about snow removal, and clearly the requirement for the vertical element is sort of troubling to a lot of our friends in the north who may have to deal with snow plowing and other snow removal activities. So have you seen good examples of how these can exist in northern climates? It seems like if you don't have the vertical element, it's just not a protected bike or a separated bike lane. But are there examples that people could look to for this?
Yeah, so I mean, in Seattle, we surprisingly, for being as far north as we are, we don't actually get much snow in the city. It all comes down as rain here and snow in the mountains. But we do we take into consideration sweeping of the street heavily, because with all the water, all of the rain we get, all the debris on the street kind of comes at the curb, which is where the bike lane is. So thinking about sweeping and plowing, we definitely think about that when we position our posts. So we have a couple of facilities where it's a one-way bike lane, and then there's the preferably 3-foot buffer with the post in the middle. And if it's just a one-way bike lane and a 3-foot buffer, we know that our sweeper is not going to be able to fit into that if you center the posts at the middle of the buffer. So for those, we actually often put the posts at the outside of the buffer, so closer to the vehicle lane. That way we're actually creating enough space that the sweeper can get between the post and the curb. We also have some posts at the entrance of each block of the PBL on Second Avenue, and those posts are actually run over by our street sweeper once every other week. And they're still, I mean, they're all beat up, but they still work today. They're the type of posts that just kind of they flex down and hit the street and then pop back up. So you can actually look into your materials to see what would work for the sweeping that you need to do.
Okay. And Carl and Ben, any from your scan of best practices, anything to report there?
Well, I was just going to cite on page 65 of the guide. There's a discussion of street sweepers, and we actually cite a list that's created by People for Bikes, which is a detailed inventory of the available sweeping options based on the needs of separated bike lanes or protected bike lanes.
That's great.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, having the buffer there is a great place to store snow. So, in that sense, separated bike lanes are a great facility if they're plowed. And I also encourage you to look at Montreal. They have a pretty considerable network of separated bike lanes up there, and obviously they get a lot of snow. And they have a really good system in place in terms of how to plow their bike lanes. And I believe they use the flexible posts as well as a lot of vertical curb as their buffers.
Fantastic. I think that we're going to have to leave it there for today, unfortunately. We do have a lot of great questions, and I hope that maybe we can carve out a little bit of additional time next week to get back to some of these. I think some of them are a little more design-focused, so we want to be sure to answer them. But one thing I'll make sure to do in the follow-up email you all get later today, I'm going to include another link to the separated bike lane planning and design guide, because I do believe that a lot of your questions can be answered in the guide itself. So I hope that you'll look back at that material and maybe take a look at it for some of your answers. And then obviously, please reach out to us if you do have questions that we can follow up with. We'd be glad to do that. I'm sorry to say that that is all the time, though, that we have for discussion today. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question specifically. Once again, I want to remind everyone that you're going to be receiving an email later today with a link to the archive page for this webinar, as well as instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance. It's also going to include a link to register for the next webinar if you haven't done so already. That one will be next week. I want to let you know that as you close out of the webinar, a very brief survey is going to appear. We really appreciate your comments and your feedback. We really try to incorporate all that feedback into our subsequent webinars, so anything that you can tell us about our performance today is really helpful. I just want to say thank you again to Dan Goodman, Carl Sundstrom, Ben Rosenblatt, and Kyle Rowe for delivering today's presentations. And I want to say thanks to all of you for attending today's PBIC webinar. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.